guys, we are here in London again with my dear friend Toby Sutton. Toby, good to see you, boy.
Lovely to see you again.
Toby is the CEO, founder of Watches of Knightsbridge. I've known Watches of Knightsbridge for years, and I approached Tobes about doing this video because I think that there is an opportunity to help people out there looking for their very first vintage Submariner, as I've done in the past, and effectively just going through the details of what to look for. Now, Toby, you buy and sell these things the whole time. How many years have you done that for?
Well, officially 14 years.
14 years,
yeah,
okay.
But it goes back further. And yeah, I've probably handled thousands of Submariners. And you're learning each time, but yeah, I'd like to say now I kind of know what I'm looking at. So yeah.
It is the quintessential watch, and we were saying before we started filming that if you show anyone this anywhere in the world, it's probably the only watch that everyone in the world would recognise.
Yeah.
And yet there are so many pitfalls, because when we talk about vintage watches, we are talking about sort of mid 1980s towards the end of 1980s before. So it's not a very, very clear world, because, and we've got the Rolex book here, the Submariner book. Should we just give that a quick flash? We're not being paid in any shape or form to promote it, and they get no commission on sales, but it feels like it's the right time to do it. But it's not the clearest of worlds, because Rolex as a business wasn't actually entirely, clear about, and still isn't to this day, about what it has made. It's not a brand that engages with clients, collectors out there. So if you wanted some information about your vintage watch from 1972, you're not getting it.
Yeah. No, you have to rely on various websites. I mean, with the Submariner, it's great because there are some brilliant reference websites out there, so you can check all the details. Which, depending on where you're buying it, you do need to check every kind of and partly due to Rolex servicing the watches and over the decades, constantly replacing parts. I would say it's pretty much a minefield, to be honest.
It is, and genuinely scary, and that's why I really wanted to do this, because I feel like I've been haven't been buying and selling, but I've been in the industry 10, 15 years, and I still feel very uncomfortable. I would lean on you as the seller, as most people do.
Yes.
Most people do.
Yeah.
And the old adage, buy the seller, not the watch, and I think that's true. What are you thinking, Tobes, when you get this in your hand? Because you bought this watch to sell, or is this in an auction?
No, this one is on Oyster Bar, which is our vintage Rolex.
So you own all those watches?
Subsidiary. Yeah, all of those watches. So they come through, we'll buy them, authenticate them, they're serviced, so we give them the full kind of authentication process.
So someone sold this to you. What is your first port of call? What are you looking at to start with?
Well, I mean, depending where we are and how we're buying it, sometimes we've only got maybe a few minutes to authenticate something. So we always start with the dial and the case, because that's where the majority of the value is on a Submariner, and probably most watches and Rolexes, but we're focusing on this. So with this example, we'd first look at the dial. The dial would say, we know that's from the mid-80s to the late 80s. So then we'd look at, okay, fine, let's check if the dial matches the case.
And how are you doing that?
So with the early Submariners, the serial number is always in between the bottom lugs.
Okay.
So we use a spring bar, open up the bottom lugs and the top lugs, because that will reveal the reference. Obviously, I know this is a 5513. Most people who are looking at it, non-date with a plexiglass, it's a 5513. Made for, I think, 27 years.
It was the longest running.
Yeah, longest running Submariner reference.
Finished in 1989.
Exactly, and this one is from 1989. It's the L series, the very last of the production run. They weren't selling very well at that point, which makes them quite rare. Having a plexiglass watch, it was kind of an old-fashioned watch at the time. So,
and plexiglass, just for people who aren't sure about that, how are you sure that is plexiglass? How do you know that's plexiglass, not crystal?
Well, the dome on the plexi, you can hear the tap, and you can, by feeling it, you can feel the plexiglass rather than the sapphire. So, yeah, when it comes to authenticating as well, I know most purchases are done online, but when you feel something, when I first pick something up and I feel it, I can generally see if something is not right, just by even the weight or the sharpness.
Do you think that the replicas out there these days are good enough to fool you to the touch? When you handle these really top-notch sort of replicas, do you think you can be caught out?
Well, in terms of like the best fake vintage, there'll generally be a mixture of original parts and fake. So that's what you're looking for. the movement is the kind of the easiest part to use. So what we're looking for is, fake case, if the watch is period correct. The best fakes will use different parts, different from genuine parts, non-genuine parts, but for them to get it all period correct, there's various ways of checking.
That actually leads me on to the next question, which is it a deal breaker? Is it like a deal breaker for you if that plexiglass isn't? We can't be absolutely sure that's the original plexiglass, but if that's not, if that's been replaced with something more modern, is that a deal breaker in your mind?
Well, it makes me go back to what we were saying. So the main value is in the dial and the case. And if they check out, so like I was saying, this dial's from the late 80s. We would check the serial number. The serial number's L series, that matches the dial. So generally that's a good sign.
And how are you checking that L matches L, the dial?
From my knowledge, obviously I know that dial will match that batch. But there's a lot of websites out there that will reference all the different kind of mark dials from meters first, maxi dials, and there's like very well documented serial ranges. So you can see if this maxi dial fits this range. Okay,
so we've done plexiglass, we've done dial, we've done the fact that the reference number will be between the lugs at the top and the serial number below. What are you referencing that serial number to? Because that's going to be unique to the watch, and it might well be in the papers, but there may not be papers. And these days, this is a later model, but we do have models that are older here.
Yeah,
it's not unusual to not have papers.
Oh yeah, so the serial number dates the watch effectively. So again, online you can type the serial number in, it will pick up an approximate date. And yeah, with paperwork, it's not the be all and end all. Because it was actually a GMT recently where it had the original paperwork. We checked the serial number, it matched the paperwork, but when we were looking closely at the number, it wasn't the right font. We looked closely at the case, and the aging on the case was not natural. It looked like it had been shaken in a box of nails, the case, and then polished to try and age the case. So effectively it was a fake case. But they had the original paperwork and they'd matched it. So if you're relying on paperwork to authenticate a watch, it's definitely not the way to go. But it does add value, obviously, when it is correct. It does add value to the watch.
For these old references, like something like this, would you expect to have papers, box and papers these days? Because I feel like most dealers out there are now at the point where if you're dealing in vintage, you're accepting that actually papers are not necessarily a deal breaker.
It's different for everyone. It's the collectors. For me, no, papers doesn't bother me. It's more the watch, the condition, the rarity. It's finding the watch.
Out of these 6 that we've got here, how many have books and papers?
So 3 of them do, 3 of them don't. Okay. But yeah, it depends on the collector. Some collectors like to collect the set, and some will be afraid of it being a watch only. But they shouldn't be. If it's everything checks out and you're buying it and it's been authenticated, then yeah, watch only is. It's fine.
I'm with you on the box and papers, and I've got a Tudor Submariner, which doesn't have anything. But one thing I couldn't live with is if the hands had been replaced. And a quick way that, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but is a visual check to see whether the tritium in this case, most of these are tritium, because I think it was at this transitional point here in 89 when they stopped using tritium.
Well, it was in 99 they stopped using tritium.
Oh, did they? Oh,
yeah.
Edit that out. Edit that out. So they stopped using tritium in 99.
Yeah.
But the one thing I can't stand is when you basically can see that the material within the hands and the seconds doesn't match the dial.
The luminous on the dial is much more important. So once we've checked that the dial is period correct, then we'll check the luminous, whether the luminous is original and hasn't been relumed. So with tritium, depending on which decade, but generally the 70s, 80s, 90s, the tritium by now's effectively died out, so it doesn't glow anymore. So we use a UV torch.
I knew you bought this for some reason.
Exactly. So this is probably one of the most geeky watch tools you can
that and the loom.
Walk around with. Yeah, no. So you'd use the loom torch. You can see it doesn't glow on that dial. But there's a trick, and not a lot of people will know. Well, they'll be like, well, how do you know it's the original tritium? Well, it doesn't glow, but it still reacts. And if you look very, very closely, you'll see there'll be little specks in the loom You'll want to see now, I know that. Which is basically just to show that it's still, just very small specks will pop out from the old tritium. So then you know that that is the original tritium. But if you're looking at tritium from the 60s, it was a different mix. So it was more, they mixed it with the zinc sulfide. It's a different appearance, different color, it's more domed, and if you put the lume torch on that, it will glow green still, like really bright. But then it will fade, it'll take about 20 seconds.
You won't see the specks? You won't see the
No,
speck
not specks, it will glow green. And then it will die after about 20 seconds.
Okay.
So if it holds the glow for more than 20 seconds, then it probably has been relumed.
Okay.
But if it fades after 20, so it's like, yeah, these little rules, but luminous is very, very important. I'd say going back to the hands, it depends again on the collector. So, but what I would say is that the tritium on the hands is fragile. So it could break, drop off at any point. Typically, dealers would color match the hands with the luminous on the dial. The luminous on the dial is pretty much imperative, it has to be original. But on the hands, people don't mind what is called color matching. So, you'd relume the hands to match the dial. But yeah, it depends.
But a watch like this might have gone in for service. You take a watch like this maybe and you have it in service with Rolex. Now, what Rolex's ambitions would be for this watch is to give it back to you in a sort of a like-new state, which would mean that it would polish the case, the bracelet possibly. It may even have replaced the dial.
Yeah.
And it may have replaced the hands. It may have replaced the crown and the insert on the bezel, the pip, all of those things. So in their eyes, they've got something they can then give a warranty to support the service of.
Yeah.
And that's in conflict with what us as the collectors want.
Yeah, for sure. Because their main priority is to waterproof the watch, make sure that, and the hands, is the first thing that they'll change.
I mean, just aesthetically, I can't get past. I'm kind of okay with the idea of color matching, and I didn't realize that was being offered so broadly. But to have a very different color tone, and I've had it on other watches, non-Rolex, but it's just too much for me personally.
It is, and yeah, hands, that might be your thing. Like polishing is a big thing with Submariners, depending on what decade, but it's a tool watch. Are they best unpolished, left unpolished? Generally, the rule is if it's already had a polish and it's probably badly polished, then it's fine to then have it repolished back to kind of as it would have been originally. If it's definitely unpolished, then yeah, we would leave it as is, because that look, the tool watch, it kind of fits in with that kind of.
And this type probably is the one area that I'm most interested in, and it's probably the most contentious. Now, the Submariner during the decades did come in different sizes. I mean, you can see that there, in thickness and I personally struggle. I really do struggle to tell when a case has been. I guess I can see when a case hasn't been polished, but I then struggle to see when it's been polished a little bit, or polished a lot, or polished badly.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent? How do you know if a case has been polished badly?
Well, you're probably
You've lost the integrity of the structure, right? That's what we're missing.
Yeah, exactly, and the thickness of the lugs. Generally, yeah, the thickness of the lugs, the wear on the inside of the lugs, because that can happen from the bracelet rubbing. So yeah, it's.
So out of these, what have been polished and what haven't, in your opinion? Is this unpolished?
Well, this one's from '99, so we've had this one polished and serviced.
Okay.
But it depends, because the earlier watches had a bigger chamfer on the lugs. So a lot of people will be looking. For that. Does it have the chamfer? But when a case is repolished, Rolex will put that, or any polisher can put that chamfer back on. But then you're looking at the thickness or the fatness of the lugs.
So that's what you're missing mainly, is the chamfer. If a job's not been done nicely,
exactly,
that's what you're missing.
The chamfer will be lost.
Okay.
And I mean, going back to the authenticity side of the case, when we're looking at a case, there's a rule basically behind the lugs. You're looking for like natural wear. So there's a lot of like fake case middles. So what you're looking for is natural wear. Behind the lugs, where the bracelet sits, there should be like a mark where it's rubbed over the decades. So that's quite a very important part, because on the fake cases, they can't replicate that kind of aging properly. And that, again, that's an important part for military submariners, because they have fixed lugs. They've never been attached to a bracelet. So if you see a military sub, you turn it over and you've seen that there's a little bit of wear behind the lugs from where a bracelet, that's a bad sign, basically.
Yeah. Right, so we should just touch on case back itself. What are you looking for there? Because I know with my Submariner, my Tudor one, it's got a Rolex case back, which it's unusual. But Rolex Submariner, what are you looking for case
You
back?
didn't tell me about that one. But, so the case back, again, when you're looking at the serial number, then you're looking if the case back matches. So the date of the case middle needs to match the case back. So in the 60s up until the early 70s, they used to date the case back. So you've got a date reference in there, the first quarter of 71, it would be dated or something like that. So you're basically, does everything tally up? Is it period correct? But what's interesting is the case backs, the references are not always the same as the reference of the case middle. So on a 5512 like we have here, they use the 5513 case back. So you've got a 5512 middle, 5513 case back. So there are rules, that you need to know. But like I said, online it is very well documented. You can find out pretty quickly whether something's not quite right.
What I really hope this video does is it just gives you an opportunity out there, if you're considering a sub, to at least start thinking about these different aspects. It may not provide all of the information you need. You may not even have the watch in hand, but at least you start thinking about these different points. And actually, before we started filming, I thought there were fewer points than there actually are. There's actually lots more than I realized. If we talk about,
we
for
could go
example,
on for hours, we really could, honestly.
Let's talk about bezel insert for a second, because bezel insert, again, they start to fade in a similar way to some dials. What are you looking for on the bezel insert?
So the bezel insert, again, you would check if it's period correct. So on the earlier bezels, the 60s, they have a fatter font. So they're called a fat font bezel. You have a kissing 4 insert. You've got a long 5. All these names that you'll type into Google, it will show something.
Yeah.
But again, it's a part, like the hands, that Rolex would have changed as soon as it went into service, unless you were adamant, do not change the insert. So
and they would have replaced it with a more modern
Exactly.
version.
So very rarely will you find a sub and it's got the original bezel insert. If it has, it's a really it's a nice point.
So that's rare. So most subs you encountered don't have the
it's rare
insert.
to find. Yeah, it might be from a decade later, 2 decades later. It might not be brand new, but whether it's actually period correct from that. But it's, again, they all age differently.
Is that one original, just based on the way that it's patinaed?
Yes. So this one, because I know a lot of people are looking for like ghost bezel insert. So we're always, when we see a ghost bezel insert.
And when we say ghost bezel, we should just clear what that up is. Some people may not. That's a lightening of the colour, because this would have been black originally.
So it's a
fully
fully faded. I would probably, this is not a full ghost bezel, but it's getting there. You could maybe call it semi-ghost bezel. But it does, dealers do ask more for, so again, they'll be faked. And so you're looking, has the bezel originally aged like that, or has it been bleached? So there's ways of telling. As you can see on this one, it still has a slight shine to the bezel. It's faded, but it has a slight, it still has the satin, and that's how you can tell that that's originally faded. If it had been aged, unnaturally with some bleach, which is how they tend to do it, you'll notice that it's a lot more like a matte, it takes the top layer off. So it'll be very matte to the feel and to the eye. So that's how you kind of can tell whether ghost bezel is original or not. But it's very important.
Interesting. Of course, it's part of the functionality of using it as a dive watch. Next up is the pip. So when we talk about the pip, we're talking about this little guy here at the top.
Yeah, I mean, these fall out all the time. So whether, this is not a deal breaker. And again, depending on which decade it's from, actually the later ones, they tend to stay in a lot more. The ones with the metal ring. So, and they age really nicely. If you're looking back on the earlier 70s, 60s, 70s ones, to have one that's original will be very, very, very difficult to, you do see them. But it's kind of it's not a deal breaker, I would say. There's, for me, the hands, the bezel, the pip, they're kind of variables that are not hugely important to the value, and it depends on what kind of collector you are.
I love a sub on a NATO strap.
Yes.
But these are all on bracelet. And the bracelet is also a key factor. It's a giveaway for the state of the watch.
Yes.
What are we looking for in the bracelet?
Well, again,
and the clasp, of course, because clasp is important.
Yeah, clasp. Well, Rolex often would change the bracelet or clasp. So if you had a faulty clasp, or you said, okay, it's not shutting down, instead of just bending it a little bit, which that's all it needed, we do that to a lot of clasps to keep the original clasps, they'll replace it, obviously, and charge you for a new one. So It's again, it's important to some people, not everyone, whether or not it has the original bracelet, because the bracelets are dated to the watch, which is nice.
So this is like a riveted bracelet.
So this one is a riveted bracelet from the 60s. This is actually made in the USA, this bracelet. So it's a different type of rivet bracelet. But if you go on to the later ones, so from up until 1972, they were dated, the bracelets, with a little date on the clasp. Then there was 3 years where they were undated, so you can't quite tell, although if it's not got a date or a letter, you know it's from those 3 years. And then 75, they started to put a letter code on the clasp.
Does it matter if it's been polished? Does it matter to you if a bracelet's been polished? Because often this is what gets scuffed when someone's wearing it.
Yeah, well, it needs to match the case. So sometimes you'll see one and the case is unpolished and the bracelet might be more polished. And again, that comes when you're authenticating the watch. The aging of the watch all has to match. So if the dial's very faded, but the case hasn't got much aging, it's super fresh, then you know maybe the dial has been swapped in, you know, something's happened.
Are we too caught up, Tobes, do you think, on condition these days, in the way that there are only a certain number of watches out there and we're all wearing them, so effectively they're decaying year by year by year?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, I'm super fussy when it comes to buying. And again, it comes to price level. We're not going too much into pricing, but if you find one that's an honest watch that's been serviced by Rolex, you know, an honest watch, the term is quite misused really, because it tends to be used for a watch that's all original. But, you know, is that an honest watch, or is an honest watch one that's been serviced every 5 years and had service parts put onto it?
Just to touch on price, we should touch on price.
The price, yes.
Vintage subs have sort of leveled off maybe in the last few years. I think it's not a bad time to consider one if you're thinking about it.
It's a good time now. Prices have definitely cooled. What I've seen now is a lot of people are trading their modern into vintage. So we get requests daily of, you know, will you trade my modern? Not so much a Submariner, but yeah, because people are noticing that vintage is a better buy investment wise. It holds the value. And they're becoming harder and harder to find.
All right, so listen, thank you. Is there anything else that's worthy of note here? I don't think we've missed anything, but I'm sure in the comments people will let us know.
I'm sure we've missed a lot. Yeah, I mean we've kind of done a quick roundup of what to check, what to look for when you're authenticating a watch. Every decade is different. So when it comes to authenticating the subs, there's a general rule, as we've discussed, but there will be a few different things depending on which decade.
What's your final bit of advice to someone out there considering buying one? What would you be buying right now if you were putting your money into a sub, into a vintage sub?
Which Submariner?
Yeah.
Depending on what you're looking at, birth year watch is a good place to start. Depending on where you are as a collector. If you're really into vintage already, then you might have your heart set on a maxi dial because the appearance is more kind of, the bigger lume plots might stand out, and that's what you like. The way a bezel is aged, it depends. I mean, a birth year watch we've been talking about.
You've got one on.
Exactly. So this is 1988. Yeah, R series.
And not on a bracelet.
Not on a bracelet.
Unpolished.
It hasn't been polished, but whether or not it's unpolished, again, I'd have to look at the service marks inside the case back.
Yep.
But it's versatile, the Submariner. Again, that's why it's so popular. You know, you can dress it up, you can dress it down.
Yep.
So it's a tall watch, but you know, on a strap, it looks. But yeah, 1988 R series, all original, a few scratches on it. It's a good place to start. But if I was to recommend something, 5513 is the quintessential non-date. I would say the 70s ones are the ones to go for, rather than the 60s. Because then you're looking at the gloss dials, the radiums, it gets a little bit messy.
70s,
70s, matte dial, tritium, you can check everything, like I said, whether the bezel, everything matches, and you don't have to be too cautious. And that's the look generally, the vintage 5513.
Brilliant. Tobes, thank you very much.
Cool.
Such a pleasure, boys. Guys, in the comments, please let us know your thoughts. I'm super excited to see what you think. It's a whole nother world, isn't it? It's a whole nother world. So thanks for joining us as always. Cheers.